Hello, this is Dr. Richard Norris, the Director of the National Arts Medicine Center in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm going to be speaking today on applied ergonomics, adaptive equipment for instrumentalists. This is applying the science of ergonomics to modifying musical instruments for the purpose of helping musicians. The first thing I'd like to talk about is seating and back strain. First of all, the chair was really not meant as a workstation. It was designed as a throne or a place to rule, hence the term chair or chairperson, but not very effective place to work or do your business. First of all, in the normal standing position, on the left we see a normal lumbar lordosis or lumbar curve. On the right side, when one sits with the thighs parallel to the ground and the knees in a 90-degree angle, there is a backwards tilt of the pelvis at about 30 degrees, which causes a flattening of the lumbar curve or loss of the lumbar lordosis. We can see on the illustration on the left that a backward sloping seat places the torso, which is here represented right under the oval head, several inches behind the sit bone, which is the angle where the thigh meets the pelvis. If you look at the middle and then the right-hand picture, you see that with a progressively forward slope to the seat, the body weight or the weight of the torso is brought more nearly directly over the sit bones, thus lessening the backward thrust or torque, tending to force the upper body backwards. A simple device such as this forward-sloping wedge cushion readily converts a backward-sloping chair, as most folding chairs are, into a forward-sloping seat, thus helping to relieve back strain in seated musicians. The illustration on the top left demonstrates how the forward-sloping position brings the center of gravity directly over the sitting bones, eliminating the torque. The center illustration shows the restoration of the normal lumbar lordosis with the forward-sloping seat, and the right illustration just shows how this forward-sloping seated position simulates or recreates the normal lumbar curve in the standing position. This is what the text is saying. The forward-sloping position comes into play in horseback riding, and the reason that a backrest is not necessary when riding a horse is because the downward angle of the thighs brings the center of weight of the torso directly over the sit bones and thus minimizes back strain. If the stirrups were shortened so that the thighs were parallel to the ground, it would be very painful on the back and uncomfortable. It's interesting to look at photos of old horse carriages from the turn of the century where, because there was no backrest, they also utilized a forward-sloping cushion. This illustrates the effect of the flat seat versus the forward-sloping seat on diaphragmatic function. The diaphragm is a muscle coming from the lumbar vertebrae and inserting around the ribs, and when on the left the normal lumbar curve is present, the diaphragm has full and normal excursion. When, as seen on the right, there is reversal of the lumbar lordosis and flattening of the lumbar curve, the diaphragm becomes tethered and the excursion shortened. This clearly has implications not only for wind instrumentalists but seated vocalists as well. This is an illustration of the flute player sitting on the wedge cushion, changing a backward sloping seat to a slight forward slope. One of the features of this cushion, which is called the Ergocush, produced by AliMed in Dedham, Massachusetts, they have a toll-free number, is that it is dual layer, with the top 1 inch being a soft open cell foam and the bottom 2 inches being a dense closed cell foam. Many of the other wedge-shaped cushions on the market are all open cell foam, and when you sit on them they completely flatten out and you lose the benefit of the forward slope. This is an illustration up on top as to what tends to happen on the flat seat. Over a period of time, the low back fatigues and the person settles down into a C-curve on the spine, which is hard on the discs and soft tissues. In the bottom illustration, the wedge seat helps the piano player sit erect with a minimal use of muscle force of both the back and the hip flexors. In terms of seating posture for the cello, not only is the forward sloping seat helpful, but there is a device called the posture peg, which can enable some cellists to sit more upright. The top illustration shows a typical type of pose for the cellist with a slightly head-forward position. Sometimes this is due to the fact that the tuning peg catches the player in the back of the neck if they were to sit up straighter, as seen in the bottom illustration. The posture peg uses a removable tuning peg that prevents this problem and allows the cellist to sit up straight without the tuning peg impinging on the back of the neck. This is a device that slips over the tuning peg and lessens the force needed for tuning and just can help to minimize hand strain. It is not related to back or seating posture. Back strain is very common in guitarists as well. In classical guitar, the footstool is often used to support the instrument. In my opinion, this is less than desirable because this creates an asymmetry with a flexed left hip and an extended right hip. The weight is not evenly distributed on the sit bones. The muscles are used unequally, and if used for prolonged periods of time, this can cause a tight left hip flexor unless hip flexor stretching exercises are done. I think a better solution is to use some type of an apoyo, A-P-O-Y-O, which in Spanish means a support, or a device that goes between the thigh and the instrument, which allows the player to sit in a more balanced, symmetrical position. This is one example. You're looking at the underside of the guitar, as seen from the player's left. The apoyo is adjustable in height as well. This shows a much more balanced position using an apoyo and also a slightly forward sloping seat. If you think the guitar is difficult from a sitting posture, the lute is even harder and has been known to be a source of, as this cartoon says, although it's cut off, premenstrual tension, pardon the joke. Seriously though, a friend of mine in Boston who is a professional lutenist consulted me with this problem. This was his typical sitting posture. The leg crossed, the rounded instrument tended to slip and slide around and was quite difficult to stabilize. Utilizing the principles that we just saw for the apoyo, I set about designing one for him. I utilized common splinting material such as orthoplast or polyform, molding it both to his leg and to the instrument, and lining it with a non-skid material and making little flanges in the front to keep the instrument from slipping. I also incorporated a small piece of fishing line at the very top of the device that would capture the end pin and further keep the instrument from slipping. This shows him using the device. I still wasn't quite satisfied with this because of his back posture, and gave him the forward sloping cushion, which finally achieved an acceptably improved playing position. In terms of other instruments, the double bass is problematic for the back, not just for playing, but for carrying the instrument as well. Especially if one is a smaller person, the instrument can cause considerable back strain just from getting it around. There are wheels that are available that should be considered a good ergonomic adaptation for this problem. They also are pneumatic, and so they cut down on the amount of shock that's transmitted to the instrument. This is a bass stool that I came across in Germany. It has full foot plates instead of putting your heel on the rung, and these foot plates are on a universal joint, so they are fully adjustable in all planes. Also notice the cutout on your left on the side of the seat. This is because the bass player's right leg or right thigh is usually extended, whereas the left thigh is flexed. Most bass players have the edge of the stool cut into the back of the right thigh, but with this clever cutaway, that problem is alleviated, and I think this is an excellent design. Here's an example not only using the wheels on the bass, but showing how the bass player often has to carry around the stool as well as the instrument. And again, for this instrument, the transportation problems contribute as much to the back problems as the playing of it. These are wheels that are actually built into a cello case, and there are several different designs on this and should be utilized. The cello in the case weighs upwards of about 35 pounds, and the wheels can really help cut down on shoulder and back strain, at least on flat indoor surfaces. This shows a backpack setup attached to the cello case for people that do traveling where the wheels are not useful because of roughness of the terrain, for example. This can be done by most outfitter backpacks type stores and can be really useful. This shows it in use, and this person's carrying most of the weight of this instrument on the hips by means of the waist strap. The waist strap is a very important component of this. Shoulder straps alone would put too much weight on the shoulders. As this photo or illustration from the 1700s show, there's really nothing new under the sun, and I guess this design was around just waiting to be reinvented. Similar devices are available. This is a tuba case available from Altieri in Denver, Colorado, and she also makes backpack style cases for other instruments. My only problem with this is there's no waist strap, but this could be added either by requesting it or by one's adding it oneself. Let's talk a little bit about problems of violinists and violists. The biggest problem that I see clinically in violinists and violists have to do with pain in the left neck and upper left shoulder muscles. This usually has to do from the fact that the chin rest and shoulder rest do not adequately fill in the space between the jaw and the shoulder, and so there is some combination of hiking and thrusting forward or protracting the left shoulder combined with rotation and tilting of the head to the left. If one has a very long neck, this compounds the problem, obviously. It's sort of like a secretary writing while she's talking on the phone, holding it between the ear and the shoulder. You can imagine that if you do this for many hours a day, there's going to be a lot of muscular and perhaps even disc-related pain in this area. The use of an extender on the telephone helps improve, although not 100% correct, the posture, and the same approach can be used for the violinists and violists. In this illustration, cork shims were placed between the chin rest and the instrument to raise the height of the chin rest. The shoulder rest was also elevated somewhat. This combination helps to fill in the space so that the person does not have to tilt the head or hike the shoulder. As illustrated here, there is no shoulder hiking or head tilting seen. There are also devices that extend the violin out away from the body. If one is very tall and has very long arms, the smallness of the size of the violin can create a cramped playing position, and so this device doesn't raise the height of the chin rest and shoulder rest, but it allows the chin rest and shoulder rest to be placed behind the instrument, effectively bringing it further out away from the body. As you can see in the upper left compared to the upper right, the upper left is without using this device, the upper right is with using the device, and the elbow flexion angle is markedly decreased on the right hand, upper right hand illustration. Chin rest can also be custom molded using a dental type approach with mold material being put right into the chin rest and put up against the player's jaw with some plastic material. and then fabricated out of wood or plastic or some other material. This is particularly useful for people who develop these practice marks that can become infected and severely problematic, or for people who are developing temporomandibular joint pain from an ill-fitting chin rest. This is a chin rest designed in Germany called a Vario, V-A-R-I-O 2000, and in the illustration that shows this from different angles, it's almost like a gooseneck lamp in that you can tilt the chin rest in or out, raise it or lower it, slide it in or out, or tilt it up on one side or the other. Here's the inventor, Ingo Volkskow, illustrating this chin rest. It's covered with nice soft material as well, and I'm fond of recommending it to my patients. He also invented a very interesting shoulder rest, which you can see in this illustration as well. There are two sort of marshmallow-like pads that are on coiled pieces of wire so that they can be adjusted and moved and placed any place on the body that gives the most secure position. But the most clever aspect of it is this outrigger that goes between the shoulder blades and creates counterforce to the natural tendency of the instrument to want to fall forward and down. In fact, one can even support the instrument almost in the playing position without using the chin on the instrument or support of the left hand, as you can see in this illustration. So it takes only a minimal amount of support from the left hand and from the weight of the chin to hold it in the playing position. I think this is really a brilliant device, and you can find information on this in the enclosed literature. There have been other attempts to do a similar thing, not quite as well in my opinion. This is a device out of Australia that uses a wire that's attached to a seatbelt-like device, and it inserts on the underside of the instrument. That was not a mistake. That was a blank space there. This is another device, a little bit bizarre, but I thought I'd include it anyway in my collection, and it's what I call the toilet plunger approach, and it's a rubber suction cup, that, not a suction cup, but a rubber cup like on a toilet plunger that goes under the left elbow and is on a single pole that rests on the ground, and it supports the left arm of the player. And I suppose there may be places where this is appropriate, such as if someone has weakness, severe weakness of the left arm, and has enough flexor strength to play, but not enough strength to hold up or support the arm, whether it's due to a rotator cuff injury or a neuromuscular disease or aging or whatever, as is obvious here. So there may be some place for this approach as well. There are problems with the frog and the bow hold as well that are not uncommon. The frog of the instrument, for those of you not familiar with it, is the little square wooden device at the very end of the string. This is where the right hand holds the instrument. This bow is string side up, and the thumb would go at the junction of the round wooden portion with the wooden frog. The frog is, again, is the part that has the little eye, the little thing that looks like an eye in it. And in this frog, the place where the thumb goes is actually quite flat and smooth and is relatively ergonomic. Compare that to this frog, which is now upside down. You're now seeing it with the string down. The thumb goes pad up right at the upper corner, which is relatively sharp. Notice where the stick, the bow stick, is wrapped with that black material. Just at that junction, just below and to the right of that, is the corner of the frog, and that's sharp. So because it's uncomfortable to put the thumb there, which is where the thumb would normally go, they tend to put the thumb where the black wrapping is, and what happens is it's much less stable, and so they use excessive force. And one can analyze the bow stick the same way a therapist or a running doctor would analyze the wear pattern on a runner's shoes. If you see that that black wrapping is all smushed down and worn down, it means that that's where the thumb is going on the bow stick, and they're probably using excessive pressure, which can then lead to tendonitis and muscle strain and the like. So analyze the shape of the frog and take a look at where the people are placing their thumb on this setup. Since one can't readily change the shape of the frog, violinists are very adverse to one taking a file to their expensive instruments. There are devices that can make the interface more ergonomic. This is a device that slips over the instrument, is commercially available through violin shops, and makes a flat place for the thumb to fit against. One can also take Coban, which is made by 3M, and wrap it around the instrument where the thumb would articulate with the bow stick. This creates cushioning, traction, and it will actually mold to the player's thumb. Left-hand problems are not uncommon in violin, and unfortunately sometimes involve carpal tunnel syndrome. This person is seen playing up in the higher positions, let's say 10th or 11th position on the instrument, which requires coming up over the body of the instrument. This then causes flexion of the wrist, and that causes increased pressure in the carpal tunnel. Gelberman did a very interesting study in 1981 where they put a pressure monitor actually inside the carpal tunnel and measured the pressures at different angles. The top line where it says controls means people without carpal tunnel syndrome. In the neutral position, the wrist has 2.5 millimeters of mercury of pressure, but as the wrist approaches 90 degrees of flexion or 90 degrees of extension, the cocked back position, this goes up more than 10 times to 32 and 30 millimeters respectively. In patients or people that have carpal tunnel syndrome, the bottom line, they're starting out in a neutral position with 32 millimeters of pressure, and with flexion and extension, this goes up to 90 degrees. There's a threefold increase. So there is a strong rationale to trying to keep the wrist in as neutral position as possible. Now, in certain instruments like the electric violin, this is not a problem. One can play as high as one likes, and you don't have to flex the wrist to get up and over the body of the instrument. Unfortunately, some electric instruments, I suppose in order to preserve tradition or to mark the place where the body normally is, they have a little outcropping that creates an obstacle so that you have to flex your wrist up and over that in order to play high up the neck. This is really unfortunate because instead of taking advantage of the fact that it's no longer necessary, one forces the wrist into the adverse position even though it's not necessary to do so, as one can see here. Now, the viola is even more of a problem in this regard because it has a wider body. But there have been attempts to redesign the viola. This is one designed by Otto Erdős, a viola maker from New York City. I believe he has now passed away. But this is the design for the cutaway for the left hand. Similar instruments have been used professionally. This is Rivka Golani, a violist. And this is Paul Delude, who is the present distributor for the instrument from Cambridge, Massachusetts, demonstrating the instrument. This shows that even in the highest positions, the left wrist is in a minimally flexed position, which I consider still orthopedically acceptable. Similar design minimize left wrist flexion on the guitar when playing in the higher positions, both on the acoustic classical guitar as well as on the electrified guitar. Many electric guitars themselves being solid body, this is a hollow body electric, this is not much of a problem. Now, this illustrates a problem with what's called the lower bout of the classical guitar. If you look at the right forearm, you can see the underside of the forearm is impinging against the forward edge of the what's called the lower bout of the guitar. This is a problem for two reasons. In this illustration, not only is there impingement on the muscles and also on the ulnar nerve, which is in this area, but it forces the wrist into a flexed position in order to approach the strings. An alternative position that many guitarists adopt to get around these problems is to thrust the right shoulder forward so that the forearm can be more nearly across the body of the instrument, so you don't get the impingement and the wrist flexion. But what happens then is they present with shoulder strain from the thrust forward or protracted position of the shoulder. There have been some attempts to get around this. This is from an article by a fellow named Grit Laskin up in Canada, I believe Toronto, who made a little bevel on the edge of the guitar. I thought this was a step in the right direction, but not taken far enough. This is me with a guitar that I play guitar and flute. This is me with a guitar that I commissioned, taking this idea to what I think is the more ergonomic conclusion. Notice I'm also using an apoyo between my left thigh and the instrument to hold it in this position. But the entire lower bout is beveled. Sorry. The entire lower bout is beveled so that there is a flattening of the guitar, so when the arm crosses this portion, now this is a sort of bird's eye view looking down over my right shoulder at my right forearm. Instead of having a sharp edge there, there is a broad flat surface so that I can maintain a normal shoulder position and wrist position and not impinge my forearm against the sharp edge there. This is a view from the front of the same thing. Let's move on to flutists. As one can see from this illustration of haute terre, the rotated and tilted head position is been around for a long time. This is the logo of the National Flute Association. This tilted and rotated head position is commonly seen in professional players as well. And on my last vacation to Club Med Borneo, one of the local band members was seen to be exhibiting flutist's neck position. I didn't talk to him about it, wasn't quite comfortable doing that. But let's look at the biomechanics here. This is from an illustration by René Caillé from his book on neck pain, and it illustrates the mechanics rather nicely. I'm going to zoom in on this. As you can see in the picture on the left, tilting the head to the left narrows down those little circles, which is a representation of the neural canals or neural foramen where the spinal nerves pass out from the spinal cord. So when the head is in a neutral position, as you see in the middle position, the openings are that size. But if you look to the left, tilting the head, or look on the right, rotating the head, both narrow down the nerve openings on the neck. Not to mention the fact that there is a lot of muscular tension involved in doing that. Now, alternative ways to hold the flute have been tried with varying degrees of success. Peter Schickley tried this one. I don't know how it worked out, but by the look of it, not very well. I came up with the idea a number of years ago of angling the head joint as a way to minimize neck strain in my patients. And of course, I was seeing flutists that had had car accidents or had arthritis in their neck or whiplash or things like that that made it very difficult for them to achieve the rotated and tilted position. This is myself illustrating on my flute the angled head position, allowing the right shoulder to be down in a comfortable position with only a minimal amount, about 10 degrees of right rotation, right lateral flexion of the head. One further advantage of the angled head joint on the flute is that when the flutist is finally ready to retire, the simple addition of a rubber tip readily converts the flute into an attractive ambulation device. It's just a joke. Sorry. Other problems of flutists that can be dealt with ergonomically have to do with the left hand. Here you can see the left fourth and fifth fingers out in full extension. They're flexed at the knuckle joints or MCP joints, but fully extended at the small joints or IP joints of the fingers. This is not the best position for playing because fingers work best from an orthopedic and neurological standpoint when all the joints are slightly flexed, as best illustrated by the middle finger on the left hand. The left index finger is too cramped up, but the middle finger is the way the fingers work best. Now, if one attempts to get a slight curve in the fingers of the left hand, you have to do it by bringing the wrist in closer to the flute, and then you wind up with a hyperextended wrist. This is problematic because it causes strain of the extensor muscles, it can put tension on the flexors, and also, if you remember that slide from Gelberman, it increases the pressure within the carpal canal, increasing risk of carpal tunnel syndrome. This is Marcel Moïse's flute from a photo that was lent to me, and it showed how he dealt with this problem by adding extra buttons onto those keys that the fourth and fifth finger normally operate. This effectively lengthens them and allows those fingers to be slightly curved without having to compensate by bringing the wrist in. At the bottom right corner, there's also a curious device that appears to be soldered onto the flute that most likely was a support for the left index finger. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Proceeding now with neck problems, but moving on to other instruments, the baritone sax is particularly problematic. It's usually supported with a neck strap, but the problem with this is that it's a very heavy instrument and it tends to pull the player forward, and you have to counteract that by contracting your neck and upper back extensors, which start to fatigue after a while. I addressed this problem by cutting open the strap and sewing each end to a simple, inexpensive backpack. One can leave the pack on if you want to keep your clarinet and flute in it for doublers, or cut the pack part off and just leave the straps in the back panel. There are devices now that are similar to this that are commercially available that are sort of like a figure-of-8 harness, but it's a much better way to distribute the weight than to just use a neck strap, especially for the bigger saxophones or even for the medium-sized saxophones on a small player. This illustrates one of the problems of the tenor sax, the soprano sax, and that is when it's a straight instrument, it's usually held out away from the body, and so you can't even take any weight on a neck strap. This throws a lot of the weight onto particularly the right thumb, and can cause similar problems that clarinetists get with severe thumb strain. This is an example of an angled neck piece or angled neck on a otherwise straight soprano saxophone. This particular one is a Yamaha, and I'm not sure if other manufacturers make an angled neck. The advantage of the angled neck is it allows the instrument to be held more vertically, and thus you can take more weight on the neck strap. This is a large, appropriately formed neoprene neck strap called Safe Sax, believe it or not. And because of the relatively light weight of the instrument, I don't have that much objection to using a neck strap for support for the soprano saxophone. So again, the neck strap in conjunction with the angled neck allow for a more ergonomic solution to supporting the instrument. This is a bass flute seen from over the left shoulder of the flutist. I want to draw your attention to the web space between the thumb and index finger of the left hand. The bass flute has a device called a crutch that's basically a bar that's shaped like a T that's used to support the instrument. I think this is a terrible idea because it puts an enormous amount of weight. Remember, because of the recurved design, it concentrates much more of the weight of the instrument over the left hand than over the right hand. It takes all of that weight and puts it in a very small area that's also a sensitive area, and that muscle, that first dorsal interosseous and adductor pollicis muscle that form the web space, are involved in playing the instrument, and so I think it's a bad idea. I came up with the idea of forming this, again, from splint material while it was warm. I cut out this shape and draped it over the hand while it was in the playing position, and then again, while it was still warm, I set the crutch into it so that when this hardened, you can run it under some cool water to harden it. So when it hardened, it had the shape of the crutch, and then I lined that little depression with some Dyson, which is thin non-skid material. This allows, and this is now a rigid device, okay? So now what happens is the crutch is securely held in that little groove because it was custom molded for it. The Dyson keeps it from slipping, but what that rigid device does is it takes that weight and distributes it over a very large area, and so it makes it much more comfortable to hold. This is the English horn, and the standard neck strap is a problem here too because of the weight of the instrument. Just like we were talking about with the baritone sax, it tends to pull the head forward, and so one has to use the neck and upper back extensor muscles. Again, this is a problem because as a wind instrument, you want to have your extra laryngeal muscles be as relaxed as possible and not be tensing them to support the instrument while you're trying to play. A better solution, and I'm going to zoom in on this, a better solution is the use of an end pin, similar to a cello, that takes the weight off the instrument. Now, this person came into my office with this end pin. The problem is that she felt the instrument was pushing her back, and in fact it is, because what happens is the weight of the instrument, if you draw a vertical line from the midpoint of the instrument, it's so far behind the end pin that there's again a torque created pushing back on the musician. I simply took her end pin and bent it just like the Stahlhammer cello pin, and that lessened the distance between the center of gravity of the instrument and the base of support, and so there wasn't nearly as much torque pushing back on her. But again, this is a better way to support the instrument than with a neck strap. I'm going to talk now about the right hand of flutists, particularly the, the left hand of flutists, particularly the base of the index finger. As you can see here, just behind the thumbnail, the flute rests on a little shelf created by hyperextending the MCP, or the knuckle joint, of the left index finger. This is really a problem, and in fact, in a survey that I did that was published in the Flutist Quarterly in the summer of '96, this was one of the largest problems, physical problems and complaints that flutists had, was pain and numbness in the index finger. The reason is that the nerve, which can be seen in the lower right picture running just over that knuckle bone, has no cushioning. There's just skin and then nerve and then bone, and so the flute tends to compress the nerve, and the player gets numbness in this distribution. One of the other problems is that if you go to the doctor with this, the first thing the majority of doctors is going to think is, oh, carpal tunnel syndrome, because you get numbness in the thumb, index, and middle finger with carpal tunnel syndrome, and this can lead one down the garden path to perhaps even carpal tunnel surgery. But if the person is aware of the playing position of the flute, then one realizes that this is an occupational nerve compression. The best way to deal with this, just like we saw with the left hand of the bass flute, is by trying to distribute the weight over a greater area. This is a commercially available device called the BoPep that clips onto the flute and serves to distribute the pressure. It's not padded though, which really would improve it, and it also doesn't do much to stabilize the flute, which is a problem as well. This is the BoPep seen from the left, and it again, it serves to distribute the pressure over a broader area. These are two little devices that I invented. They're not commercially available at the moment, but this is the design. The one for the left index finger is seen on the left and has a hook or a curved design. They're foam lined where they contact the fingers and cork lined where they contact the flute, which the BoPep is not. The BoPep is hard plastic, and many people complain of it scratching the flute. This is how it fits around the finger, and since many players do play with the flute down at an angle, what this does is not only distribute the force, but it grabs onto the index finger so that one doesn't have to stabilize the flute by pressing hard against the jaw with the left index finger, which aggravates the nerve compression and can also cause problems like loosening of the lower teeth and temporomandibular joint problems. Regarding the right hand, this is what I call the natural position of the hand. The reason I call it that is that when the pads of the fingers are facing the floor, the edge of the thumb is facing up towards the palm of the hand with the fingernail facing outwards. Now, if you look at this, and this is the relaxed position of the hand, you almost never see the flutists holding their right hand in this position. The reason is that the contact point, as illustrated here, is very, very small, and it's over a bone, and so this is not well tolerated. You have a lot of pressure, highly concentrated in a bony, pressure-intolerant area. So what most flutists do, and if you look at the left-hand side of the illustration, you can see the right thumb is rotated or supinated, pad up, because this is the soft, comfortable portion of the thumb. The problem is that it causes the other fingers to pronate. If you look at the index and middle finger, they're rolled outwards, and it also makes it harder for the pinky to reach its cluster of keys. Again, this is the natural playing position, but it's not very comfortable because the edge of the thumb is right up against the flute and the pressure is in a very small area. Okay, so this is the device that I invented called the Steady Rest, and it has an extension on it that comes out that serves two purposes. It distributes the weight over a large area, and it also makes the weight of those mechanism rods fall through the base of support. I drew that little line on the slide so you could see the weight falling through the base of support instead of normally it falls outside the base of support. This has the effect of serving as an anti-roll device. This shows the increased surface area. I put a little bit of cork grease on the thumb rest and then outlined it on the photograph so that the pressure is distributed over a very large area compared to that little black spot that you saw before. And using the combination of these two devices, the flute can now be held in a stable position without even pressing it up against the jaw. This cannot be done with Bopeps or with no orthotic devices at all. And it's my opinion that just the way that the chin rest and shoulder rest improve the ergonomic interface between the violinist and the violin, the flute needs something like this to improve the interface between the body and the instrument. For the right hand of the bass flute, I came up with this gadget. Again, this is made out of splint material, molded to the right forearm. Coming out on the left are two coat hangers that I incorporated, two coat hanger wires that I incorporated into the splint. And then at the far left is a piece of splint material that I molded to the barrel of the flute, again lined with that Dyson or non-skid material. This shows it in place. The splint is strapped to the underside of the forearm. The wires are molded to follow the curve of the wrist, and then you can see the half circle of the cup, if you will, that supports the body of the flute. The purpose of this device is to get the right thumb out of the equation because it's such a wide barrel and the right-hand side of the flute is still so heavy, even though it's less than the weight borne on the left hand, that right thumb strain is quite common in bass flutists. So you can see here the thumb is not even in contact with the flute, and this device is sort of substituting for the thumb, giving opposition to the fingers. With the sleeve pulled down, it's rather cosmetic, and of course one can paint this with some silver or aluminum paint so that it's hardly noticeable on the flute at all. We left this white so that it would show up where the device actually is and the position of it. Okay, I want to talk about kids now. I actually did some training in pediatric orthopedics and pediatric rehabilitation and have a particular interest in injury prevention in youngsters. I think the trend of having younger and younger children play the flute is really a big problem. If you think about youngsters playing violins and violas and cellos, they have scaled down instruments. They have 16th size cellos and 8th size violins, but 5- and 6-year-olds playing the flute are still playing full-size instruments. Now, I call the group of modifications that I designed the petite flute, and this is sort of a sub-talk within the talk. Let's look at this is a 9-year-old, but she's a rather small 9-year-old, and she plays a standard adult flute. Now, this is a bird's eye view looking down. I'm standing up on a sofa or something, shooting down on her. And look at the horrendous position of particularly the left hand. The wrist is in extreme radial deviation. She can hardly get that ring finger and the pinky onto the keys. The shoulder is brought way across or adducted way across the body. The head is turned way to the side, etc. Now, they do have adaptations for kids, but the only one that's really used is the recurved head joint. If you look at this, and this is the same kid, this is from the Emerson Flute Forum, the same kid on the top and the bottom playing a recurved head joint on the top, a standard flute on the bottom. If you look at her right arm, for example, for a moment, even though it's closer to the body, there's more elbow flexion on the top picture than on the bottom picture, her elbow is still abducted. It's still held up in the air, rather, and that causes a lot of shoulder strain. And the problem is that with the recurved head joint, this is still basically a straight flute, and the teachers encourage the kids to hold the flute parallel to the ground, and this causes a lot of right shoulder fatigue. And if you ever watch recitals by some of these little kids, I mean the 6- and 7-year-olds, they start off playing and within a couple of minutes that right elbow is down by their side because they can't hold their arms up, and then they're back to that tilted and twisted head position. Also realize that the reach and the spread of the fingers is still the same, both on an adult flute and even though you use the recurved head joint. And so for little hands, it's a really huge stretch. This is a head joint that I designed similar to the angled flute for the adults, but it's sort of an acute angle instead of an obtuse angle. It's about 150 degrees as opposed to the other one, which was 30 degrees, but it allows the kids to keep their head in a neutral position and to have the arms down in a comfortable position. Now, you do need to use this with those little orthotics, what I call the steady rests that I showed earlier, because that helps to stabilize the flute. Other adaptations to this setup, again, the concept of the quote-unquote petite flute, is the use of a flute post. This is a rigid metal post attached to a ring at the bottom, and the ring is attached to a strap that slips over the head and over the left shoulder, and then comes around the back and attaches back to the ring. And the post has a little sleeve, a little plastic sleeve that extends out up above the end of the post, creating a little well. And the post on the flute that forms the post for the B and the B flat key fits very nicely right in there, and it happens to be just about at the center balance point of the flute. And it creates a little joint so that the flute has complete freedom of motion, but the weight of the instrument is now supported on the left shoulder instead of supported in the hands. And again, if you ever watch these little kids trying to hold and support basically an adult instrument, a lot of them really struggle with it. It's a little hard to see here, but on her right thumb, she's also using one of those extenders, the right steady rest, and I think one on the left hand as well. This design can be adapted very well to the alto flute. The alto flute is too long for most adults and creates that same sort of stretched out, strained position that you see in the little kids on the standard C flute. And so the head joint can be recurved to create a much more comfortable and orthopedically correct ergonomic playing position for the alto flute. Now, it's interesting, if you look at an alto flute, this is a standard C flute, but if you look at an alto flute, it has little buttons on it that narrow the interkey distance to bring it down to what a standard C flute is, so that adults don't have to really stretch and strain because the keys are further apart in an alto flute. Why don't we do this for the kids? Nobody is doing this, and I have the idea to take these little buttons that you saw earlier, and just the same way you can modify the alto flute to solder them on. It's a little hard. I'm sorry I don't have a pointer that I can't point them out, but on those same two keys that you saw lengthened on Marcel Moïse's flute, there are little extenders soldered on there. The little long lever that comes out just past that, the G sharp lever, is lengthened. And then the keys for the right hand have buttons on them to reduce the inter-key distance. So all of these modifications, the angled head joint, the reducing the inter-key distance, the steady rests, and the flute post to support the weight, when taken together is what I refer to as the concept of the petite flute. A further modification has to do with the cluster of keys for the right pinky. And notice the big stretch between the ring finger and the pinky, and this commonly causes tendinitis of the intrinsic muscles of the hand that are in that web space, both in adults and in kids. Angling that foot cluster in towards the pinky makes a lot of sense and reduces the amount of stretch. This is done by John Lunn up in New Hampshire, and I think is an excellent design. Let's talk about elimination of static loading. What is static loading? It's any force, usually an external force, that's applied to the body for prolonged periods of time. The body in general does not like static loading, and it's a source of muscle strain and fatigue. This is a picture from an industrial medicine book, and on the left, picture A, you see this drill. Because of the way the wire hangs down, there's a torque on it, and so the person has to use a lot of force to control it. That's a type of static loading. On the right, they've minimized this by supporting the instrument from overhead, thus eliminating the static loading and the force. Well, this is an adult using that flute post, and while I think it's primarily good for kids, if someone has just had shoulder surgery or shoulder injury or gets pain or fatigue when recovering from an injury, the flute post can help eliminate the weight of the flute off the hands, to take it off the hands. So that's a type of eliminating static loading. The clarinet causes significant right thumb problems from static loading. As you can see here, the entire 2 pounds of the instrument is borne on the right thumb. This causes strain of the ulnar collateral ligament of the thumb and is a very common and severe problem in many clarinetists. One can make a type of splint to support the thumb, but this really inhibits wrist motion and is not, while it may work for the recorder because there's not as much wrist range of motion required, it's probably not acceptable for most clarinetists or oboists. This is a device created by Dr. Hunter Fry in Australia that he calls the clarinet post. It's a rather complex contraption, but it's also rather interesting, and so I thought I'd include it. The thumb rest has to be removed and is replaced by a little projection off the bottom of the instrument that drops into that little hole that you can see at the end of the tube that's resting against the player's stomach. So it serves to capture it in there and hold it in there. You can lift the instrument out of it, but it keeps it stable. The tube is adjustable in height, and then there's a dual strap system to adjust the whole contraption against the stomach. And supported on the neck, of course. This actually frees up the right hand and allows for some interesting alternative fingering, such as using the right index finger to operate the keys normally utilized by the left pinky. There is another device, I don't have slides of it, but it's called the Fred, F-H-R-E-D, made by Quadlibet, Q-U-O-D-L-I-B-E-T, out in Colorado, that also is designed for clarinet and oboe and works quite well. I've tried it and recommend it a lot. It's a lot simpler to use than this, but I don't have slides of it. This is another device for the clarinet called the Weightlifter by Bob James. The bell of the instrument rests on the rubber edge there, and it supports the instrument, taking the weight off the hands. Here you can see that it's supported even without the use of the hands. This is a nice device. The main drawback is that it's quite heavy for traveling, but it may be useful for practice. Other modifications that we've done include the bass trombone. This was a young lady who came to me with problems in the left hand, and if you look at her left hand, it's not hard to understand why. The left index finger has to reach up high, stretch actually, to go over the mouthpiece. The middle finger is widely stretched or abducted to go around this hard vertical post that is the strut of the instrument. And the left thumb has to be hyperextended back to reach the key that the thumb operates. We worked out a system working with her instrument repair shop whereby instead of having to put the left index finger up over the bell of the instrument, a little ring was created so that she could support it from underneath the mouthpiece. Regarding the left middle finger, that vertical strut is now wrapped with coban, so again it creates a soft surface, and there's actually a depression that gets molded in it from the pressure of the middle finger, distributing the forces. And we had the thumb key put on a sliding adjustable post so that it could be moved much further forward so she doesn't have to reach back as far. This is one example of the way that ergonomics can be applied to musical instruments to help improve biomechanics and lessen a risk of injury or to treat injury. This just shows the instrument without her holding it. Again, you can see the little hook coming from the vertical strut, which is now wrapped with coban, coming up just under the bell of the mouthpiece, and then just to the left of the coban strut is the thumb rest, which is now on an adjustable post, so the position can be fine-tuned to what suits her. The last instrument I'm going to talk about is the bassoon, and this device deals with problems of the left hand and wrist. One may not appreciate it, but despite the seat strap, there's a fair amount of torque or pressure put in the left hand. The left hand not only has some weight falling onto it, but also has to control the rotation of the instrument. There is a little leather strap that comes out from the butt end of the instrument that the player sits on, called the seat strap, and then the instrument rests against the right thigh. So it basically only has 2 points of support other than the hands. This is a little device. I'm going to zoom out so you can see it better. And it's still in the prototype version, so it's rather crude, but I think you get the idea. There's a clamp that goes on the back right leg of the chair. I drilled a little hole in the clamp that accepts a dowel, and attached to the dowel about at eye level, at the player's eye level, you can't see it, is a monofilament fishing line. Attached to the monofilament fishing line is a little paper clip that's been opened up so that it acts like a hook, and it's hooked in at one of various places to those little metal rods that run up and down the length of the bassoon. You have to fine-tune each one, but basically what you want to do is to find a position whereby the pole acts as a restraint. The pole and the fishing line act to just exactly counterbalance the tendency of the bassoon to fall forward, so that when the player drops their hands, as you see here, the instrument still stays in the playing position. Now, there have been other ways that we've tried to deal with this problem. One was hooking it to a belt. That worked okay in terms of getting the weight off the hands. The problem is that the person was getting back strain because now they had to use the back muscles to support the weight of the instrument. Then we tried putting the belt around the back of the chair, which worked until the person went to stand up, and then they have to remember to unbuckle the buckle, otherwise the chair comes up with them when they go to stand up. So this, I think, is the best one we've come up with so far, and really holds the instrument very nicely in the playing position and basically eliminates the static loading on the left hand. Oh, I lied. There's one more. The last one, and the really last one I'm going to talk about, is the tuba. oftentimes the tuba is either supported on the left thigh or on the chair. Now this guy doesn't have much room to put it on the chair, so he supports it on the left thigh. But this not only can be uncomfortable, but there are little nerves that run in this area, lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, for example, and one can actually get nerve compression from the weight of the instrument. This player came up with this device himself. You may notice that there are two rubber straps that go around the large part of the tube of the instrument, and they serve to hold a little peg with a little rubber tip that's poking up in the air. The instrument sitting on the floor with the bell down on the floor. And that little peg with its little tip now can fit on a very small part of the chair because you don't need to support the largeness of the instrument. And here it shows nicely how it's clamped to the instrument using those two straps. And again, elimination of static loading off the guy's leg, putting the weight onto the chair instead of onto his leg. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture and found it useful both for the musicians and the practitioners, health practitioners that may be viewing this. I hope I've stimulated you to come up with your own ergonomic solutions and have given you some pointers as to ones that already exist. Remember, there will be a flyer included with this video telling where to obtain the products that are commercially available. Some of the ones that I developed are not commercially available. They're things that I made one at a time for patients. If there's any manufacturers out there that are interested in teaming up with me, give me a call. And this tape is copyright care of Richard Norris, 1997, even though it doesn't say it in writing. And I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much.